Today, we are going to go through my bluffing masterclass. This is actually part of my tournament and cash game masterclass at pokercoaching.com. A lot of you in the comment section down below have told me that you have a hard time knowing when to bluff. So I'm going to put you on the fast track to success so that you know when to bluff. If you simply wait around for good hands and try to cooler your opponents, at best, you're going to be a small winner from poker, even in the small stakes games. Against the worst players, if you don't ever bluff, you're going to have a difficult time winning. And if you want to be a big winner, you need to learn how and when to bluff effectively. So I'm going to be giving you my bluffing decision framework in this video. Before we get started, though, there are a few terms you need to know. Auto calls are hands your opponents will easily call with. These are hands your opponents are never folding. Say they have the nuts. That's an auto call. They're never folding. Auto folds are hands that your opponents will easily fold. These are going to be busted flush draws, busted straight draws, maybe bottom pair or middle pair if the pot's gigantic and the board runs out scary. Okay? And then blockers. A blocker is a relevant card in your hand that prevents or lessens the likelihood of your opponent having a certain hand. For example, say the board has 3 spades on it. If you have the ace of spades in your hand, you know that your opponent cannot have the nut flush, which reduces a large number of potential flushes that they could have, especially if they would only play naturally any ace-x suited, maybe, I don't know, king-9 suited and better, and then suited broadways and suited connectors. By having the ace in your hand, you may remove a third of the potential auto calls that your opponent would have, which means they're far more likely to have an auto fold. So here is my bluffing decision flowchart. Let's walk through this slowly. We're going to start at the top with frequency. Should you bluff or should you not bluff? Here's what you want to be asking yourself anytime you're in any scenario, especially on the river. Number 1, is my opponent capable of folding? Will they fold bottom pair? If they will fold bottom pair, then you want to consider bluffing. If they will not fold bottom pair or ace high or whatever, if they're not going to fold anything, you probably don't want to bluff. Who'd have thought? Next, do you lack showdown value? Is it going to be difficult for my hand to check behind on the river or check the river and win? If you're sitting there with a pair yourself and the board's not that coordinated, you usually have showdown value. So do you lack showdown value? No, you have showdown value, so that should make you less inclined to bluff. If you do not have showdown value, say you have 6 high, say you bet the flop and the turn with a bad end of a straight draw, and you have 6 high on the river, you should probably bluff, because if you check it back, you always lose. Next, do you have many value hands in your range? Are there a lot of logical hands that you would have played in this manner that are very strong? If you have a lot of value hands in your range, you should be more inclined to bluff. If you do not have many value hands in your range for whatever reason, you should be less inclined to bluff. Okay? Next, are my blockers highly relevant? Like on that 3 spade board, if you have the ace of spades, that ace of spades is very relevant. The king of spades is also relevant. So, do you have a good blocker? Yes. If you have 2 hearts in your hand and the board contains 3 spades, that's not good. The answer would be no. Do you unblock your opponent's auto folds? This is a tricky one, but essentially, do the cards in your hand block the hands in your opponent's range that would automatically fold to a bet? So if you think your opponent's going to be in the pot with bottom pair with a lot of ace or king kickers, maybe having an ace or a king in your hand is kind of bad then, right? Next, does my bluff tell a credible story? Would you logically play a value hand in this manner in your opponent's eyes? That's important. Is this a spot that your opponent would think you would play a good hand in this manner? This is going to vary from player to player. Okay. You'll have some no's and you'll have some yeses for most scenarios. Sometimes it'll all line up yes, sometimes it'll all line up no, sometimes it'll be all over the place. If your opponent's not capable of folding though, be way less inclined to bluff. And from there, it's a bit of a, I'm not going to say guessing game. It's like you have to figure out which factors matter most. Let's say we do decide on don't bluff. We have a lot of no's. Well, then don't bluff. If we have a lot of yeses though, we're probably going to go for it. Then you need to figure out your size. Should we be betting small or should we be betting large? And look, in game theory optimal world, quite often hands are using mixed frequencies, sometimes betting big, sometimes betting small, sometimes higher showdown value hands are betting bigger, sometimes smaller. The actual game theory optimal strategy is difficult. I'm here though trying to give you a framework that will help you make sure you're mixing it up to some extent and using logical hands in logical scenarios. So, do you have no showdown value at all? If you have no showdown value at all, say you have the 5 high on the river, you should probably be more inclined to bet big because you really don't want your opponent to hero call you with king high or ace high, right? If you have some showdown value, a tiny, tiny bit, say you do have ace high on the river and you decide you should probably bluff with it, that might be a better hand to bet small. Again, not necessarily always in GTO world, but it's a simple framework we can use here. So if you have ace high and you bet small, sometimes your opponent will call with king high and you'll be pleasantly surprised. Next, does my opponent have a lot of marginal made hands that you are trying to make them fold? Like a lot of middle pairs. If your opponent has a lot of middle pairs and the board contains, let's say, 3 to a flush, you really don't want to bet small here. Should you bet small? If your opponent has a lot of middle pairs, should you bet... my brain's getting confused. If your opponent has a lot of middle pairs, you want to be betting large because you want them to fold those. If you bet small, they're going to be somewhat inclined to call them. The opposite of this is if your opponent either has a really good hand or nothing. So the answer here would be no. If your opponent either has a really good hand or nothing, you typically want to bluff using a small size because if they have nothing, they're going to fold to any bet. And if they have a really good hand, they're not going to fold to any bets. This is actually a very good exploit where quite often you know your opponent either has a busted straight draw or a flush. If they have a busted straight draw, they're going to fold to any bet. So you can bet tiny. If they have a flush, well, they're never folding. So you should bet tiny when you do happen to bluff them. Next, do you block many nut hands? If you have blockers to the nuts, you should usually bet large because essentially you are representing the nuts, right? And you know your opponent cannot have the nuts. If you do not block many nut hands, though, you should typically bet using a small size because your opponent's more likely to have the nuts, which will automatically call you. Next, am I trying to get my opponent off of a strong hand? Strong in quotation marks because this varies from spot to spot. Are you trying to make them fold top pair or 2 pair? If you're trying to make them fold a really good hand, you better bet big. If you're not trying to get them to fold a very good hand, you're trying to get them to fold, let's say, bottom pair, you can usually go smaller or ace high or king high or whatever. Next, are you representing a nutted hand? Am I saying I have the nuts? If you are, bet big. There are a lot of spots actually where you may be in a scenario where you don't have a whole lot of nuts, but you have a lot of, let's say, top pair good kickers that can reasonably go for value. In that scenario, betting large with all of your bluffs is often a mistake. You should bet small with your bluffs because you also want to bet small with all of your good but non-premium value hands. Okay? I know there's a lot to this framework. There's a lot here. But take your time, go through this scenario in every bluffing spot, and you're going to be able to figure out if you should bluff, and if you should bluff, how much you should bluff. Let's go through an example. You raise at 3 big blinds pre-flop from the button with 7-5 of clubs. And the big blind, a weak, tight player calls. This is very important because a weak, tight player is capable of folding. So we're already starting off with a yes over here, right? If your opponent's a super loose calling station, we're starting with a no, so be careful. Flop comes 10 of diamonds, 9 of diamonds, 4 of hearts. We have 7-5 of clubs. Not a good spot, but against a weak tight player, we should probably continuation bet every single flop because they're not going to check raise often enough and they're going to check fold too often. So they check, we continuation bet 33% pot, and they call. Fine. Turns the 9 of spades. They check, we check it back. They're never folding a 10, they're never folding a 9, they're never folding a 4. So we don't want to be betting in this spot. We're just giving up, at least on the turn. The river's a 6, and the big blind checks again. Should we bluff and how much? Well, we're going to use the framework. You want to go pause the video and fill it in yourself first. See what if you come up with the same answer I do. Do it. You might as well. It's good practice. All right. Is your opponent capable of folding? Yes. Do you lack showdown value? 7 high has no showdown value. So yes. Do you have many value hands in your range? Not so much. In this scenario, do we really want to value bet with a 4 or a 6? Not so much. That's not so good for us. Are your blockers highly relevant / do I unblock my opponent's auto folds? What are the auto folds here? On 10, 9, 4. So what are the auto folds? Auto folds on 10, 9, 4, 9, 6 are King Jack, King Queen, Queen Jack, Jack 8, maybe Queen 8, and diamonds. So do I have a King, Queen, Jack, or diamonds? I do not. So I essentially unblock. I don't have any of the hands that my opponents will obviously fold, right? So that's a really, really good reason to bluff. If I was sitting here with King, Queen of diamonds, I should be way less inclined to bluff. And I also may not necessarily lack showdown value. This 7-5 of clubs is a way better hand to bluff in this spot than King, Queen of diamonds, for example. Next, does my bluff tell a credible story? This is somewhere between yes and no. It depends on the opponent. Remember I said that a story depends on your opponent's perception of you. Maybe they think you would check it back with some 10s and then you'd value bet them on the river. Who knows what your opponent's thinking? Weak type players, though, typically think their opponents have it when they make a bet. Okay. Next. We're gonna bet. Notice we have mostly yeses over here, so we're gonna be betting. Question becomes, what size should we use? Do you have no showdown value at all? 7 high has no showdown value, so yes. Does the opponent have many marginal made hands? Well, they have maybe some 6s, maybe some 4s, probably not that many 6s. They may have some 4s. Do they have ace high, king high, queen high? Are these marginal made hands? Probably not. I don't know. This one's in the middle between yes and no. Do I block many nut hands? What are the nuts here? Any hand with a 9. They can have kickers all over the place. Not really, though. Are you trying to get your opponent off of a strong hand? This is a very important point on this one. Am I trying to get my opponent off of a strong hand? No, right? We're trying to get our opponent off of a 4 at best, because no one's folding a 10 or a 9. And we're also trying to get them off of king high and queen high and jack high. Maybe ace high, right? So no. And I would actually say here, this is a really important no. Because if they have a 10 or a 9, they're never folding, right? And they don't have very many 9s, but they certainly could have a 10. Next, are you trying to represent a nutted hand? Are you trying to say I have a 9? No, not at all. I'm trying to say I have a 10 or pocket 8s. Something like that, right? So the answer here is no. So this is an interesting one where we have some yeses and some nos. So we have to use a little bit of logic to figure out which of these factors matters most. Remember how I said in GTO world, 0 showdown value does matter, but it's like kind of all over the place, where sometimes no showdown value hands bet big, sometimes they bet small. This is one of these spots where I would have to imagine the 7-5 is going to go for a small bet. Does my opponent have a lot of marginal made hands? Like I said, this factor's kind of in the middle. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. It's tough to know what they even consider to be marginal. Maybe they consider ace high marginal. Who knows? And I think these 3 factors, especially the bottom 2, are all very important. Am I trying to get them off of a strong hand? No. Am I representing the nuts? No. So this is a spot where even though I have the 7 high, no showdown value, I'm probably going to go for a small-ish bet. Now, in my tournament and cash game masterclass at pokercoaching.com, if you study that, you know that the smallest bet size you should make on the river when you're playing with any sort of medium or deep stack is 50% pot. That is the smallest bet you want to be using in game theory optimal world. Exploitatively, maybe we can go smaller. But if we're trying to play anywhere near GTO in this spot, we're going to want to go for roughly 50% pot in this scenario. And that's what I would definitely do in this spot. I would have gone through the framework in my head and would have came up with a 50% pot bet on the river. And I would have done it. And sometimes I call, or sometimes they call, and sometimes they fold. But more often than not, the pot's going to flow your direction in this spot because they're going to have a lot of pair of 4s and worse. So again, here's the flow chart. Save it, print it out. I don't mind. If you want lots of more flow charts, for example, when you should be continuation betting and how much, when you should be value betting on the river and how much will your particular hand, etc., etc. We have a lot of flow charts in the cash game and tournament master classes at pokercoaching.com. So please, please, please make sure you take advantage of those resources. I've done a lot of work to help my students get good at poker, and flow charts like this are an easy way to make sure you're making perhaps not the most perfect GTO play, but certainly a very strong, reasonable play that will usually have you making better decisions than your opponents across the board. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video, if you learned something from this flowchart video, do me a favor, click the like and subscribe button down below. If you know a weak, tight knit or Alan Kessler, make sure you send them this video on Twitter. Go tag him. Post a link to this video. This will go a long way to improving Alan Kessler's life substantially because I'm not sure he bluffs often enough. That's me for today. If you enjoyed the video, again, click like and subscribe below. Good luck in your games. Have fun. And when your bluff gets called, blame the flowchart, not me. I'll talk to you next time.